Lindsay Ellis came out with a video here a week or so ago, basically talking about JK Rowling and the death of the author. I believe her video was explicitly called "Death of the Author Part 2: Electric Boogaloo." Uh, Talking about how if you enjoy Harry Potter, which I'll be honest, I do. I've been a Potterhead since around the time the fourth book came out. Uh, then how do you square that with Rowling's unapologetic shitbaggery? And basically, the long and short of it is, don't buy the stuff that will fund her. It's really as simple as that. So, Sargon apparently couldn't leave this alone and has something to say about canceling JK Rowling. As we all know, Sargon is just a general shitbag. So it's no surprise that he is transphobic. I can't recall off the top of my head. I remember in his one of his, I believe it was the second debate with Vosh, where he kept talking about breaking a woman's skull, talking about trans people in sports. So let's see what he has to say about Lindsay Ellis's case against J.K. Rowling. And as normal, we're going to speed up Sargon a little bit, both because it's a bit of a longer video than I like to do, and also because Sargon will always take a minute to say what normal people can say in 30 seconds. So, Sargon, Frank, my good friend, take it away.
This video is going to be very complicated, and I run the risk of getting into some trouble with the powers that be, because I'm going to be taking the side of notorious TERF, JK Rowling, in the debate on the...
Holy shit. Like, that's got to be a Photoshop, right? Wow. This is the classic conservative meme. Everyone you don't like is a Nazi. No one is calling Rowling a Nazi. No one is saying that she is a fascist or anything like that. She's just a TERF. She's a liberal TERF. They exist.
Influence of one's chromosomes over one's sex and over one's gender. And I will be in opposition to a YouTuber called Lindsay Ellis and Riley Dennis. Lindsay Ellis is a cultural critic, a film critic, and so we're going to be going through quite a lot of this. I'll try and keep it as simple as I can, because I think this is actually quite straightforward if you just know how to lay it out. And so, let's begin. Lindsay, what's the...
This should be excellent if he thinks it's that simple to lay it out, the case for turfery and the general shitbaggery we're seeing here.
Problem.
So I've been seeing a lot of people on Twitter, a lot of which are in my mentions, discussing Death of the Author and asking how we should apply this to our newly out and proud, incredibly transphobic JK Rowling. The warning signs were there. It kind of began like a few months ago when people were noticing that she was liking some really hardcore right-wing TERFy tweets. TERF meaning trans-exclusionary radical feminist.
So JK Rowling is a TERF, a gender-critical feminist who is opposed to the intersectional feminists on the basis of what it is to be a woman.
Like, just within the last 24 hours, we have her...
So I think I should clarify here. A woman is anyone who identifies as a woman. It's as simple as that. Trans women are women. Simple. I know that this causes people a lot of issues because a lot of conservatives need hard definitions that you can statistically identify people by. But no, women are women. If you sincerely, authentically identify as a woman, you're a woman. It's as simple as that.
Comparing providing gender services to young people with gay conversion therapy, linking to fringe weirdos and Medium posts like it's like some authority.
We definitely don't want public figures who get millions of views promoting fringe weirdos to their audiences, do we, Lindsay? So what are you using as the bedrock of your own beliefs in opposition to JK?
It depends on what the fringe weirdos are advocating for, Sargon. I mean, if they're advocating for the fringe belief that trans people deserve equal rights, deserve human rights, I have no issue with them advocating for that. The issue is JK Rowling is and people of her ilk are advocating against those rights and advocating for people to essentially do violence against trans people. And I know what a lot of people are going to say. Oh, she's not advocating violence. She's just telling them the truth. They're not women. Well, when you misgender someone, when you deny someone's identity that way, that is a form of violence. And we have ample evidence to show that this kind of behavior where you disregard someone's identity, where you misgender them, this causes harm. It causes depression, anxiety. It can lead to suicide. These are all issues that simply accepting someone's identity as they sincerely claim it is a great way of preventing harm. Simple as that.
JK Rowling.
Biological sex is, in fact, much more complicated than the simple X and Y chromosome. Trans YouTuber Riley Dennis did a video on the subject a few years ago, so I'll go ahead and link to that, and I'll let her speak to that issue. That's not what we're talking about.
Ah yes, trans YouTuber Riley Dennis, who doesn't believe in biological sex. Definitely not a fringe weirdo. So we have to take a segue off of the path of Lindsay Ellis's train of thought in order to figure out what exactly it is that Riley Dennis is proposing. Now, Lindsay linked two different videos, but both dealing with the same subject, and called some variant of the phrase, biological sex does not exist. JK Rowling is in direct opposition to this assertion. She believes that sex is real, and sex being real is the basis of, say, things like same-sex partnerships or women's experiences in the world, which is what Lindsay actually links to.
So this is a common right-wing turf. Well, I shouldn't say right-wing. It's a common turf transphobe bit of rhetoric that sex and gender are the same thing, and that therefore you can't change your sex at all. To which I ask to the trans turfs out there, such as Blair White and Buck Angel, what are you transitioning then? Because if you can't change your sex, and sex and gender are the same thing, what are you transitioning? What are you changing? Because it seems to me that especially once hormones are introduced to the equation, the difference between men and women is in how they present. And I know there are a few medical conditions that affect AMABs and AFABs differently, but this is why it's good to have a complete medical history. And we need to study how those are affected by transitioning. As simple as that, really.
And then she goes on to say that in fact nobody is saying that biological sex doesn't exist.
And as is the case with so many transphobes, she is arguing against a position that nobody actually has.
The two videos she is citing are specifically arguing that biological sex isn't real.
And as is the case with so many transphobes, she is arguing against a position.
When we say something is a social construct, it means it's something that is real as much as we interact with it. A social construct is a sociological idea, basically defining things which have no real basis in the physical, observable, objective reality, like money. We didn't go out into nature and find the money tree, and that's how we decided to exchange goods and services. Someone decided hundreds of years ago that if you value something at an arbitrary amount, then you can acquire that amount of currency for the good or service and use that currency to abstract your labor. This is it was a really useful thing because you no longer had to Like if you needed a new shirt or something, you no longer had to go to the tailor and say, "Well, I make chairs. I need or I'm a carpenter. I work with wood. I need some clothing. Do you have any chairs you need repaired? Do you need some new chairs or some new woodworking done?" And if she didn't, then you had to figure out what she wanted and had to acquire that. You know, maybe she needed some new pottery, so then you'd have to go to the pottery guy and uh, ask them if they needed some woodworking done, so you could get some pottery to trade for some shirts. Once we abstracted everything with money, we were able to say that, uh, well, I'm going to sell these chairs to whomever needs them, and I will acquire a certain amount of currency, which I can then use to buy shirts when I need them. And I don't need to go around and do a big convoluted fetch quest chain to get the chairs, the shirts I need. This is a good idea until people started hoarding the money, and then we started dealing with some major inequality issues, which we're still fighting against today. This is why a lot of leftists, and particularly anarchists, believe that money should be eliminated, because without money we can't. You know, if you don't have money, if everything is the value of the labor, the product or object or whatever you're talking about trading, then it's difficult to hoard the power of money, and also the fact that money can be used for abstract things like favors or influence. Like you can't you can't go to someone and say, "Hey, I got this really nice chair. You know, I'll give it to you in exchange for a favor down the road," unless they need a chair or unless they really like the chair. Whereas you can go up to someone and be like, "Hey, I'm gonna need a favor here in a little while, and I want to make sure that I got someone lined up for it. So here's $1,000." We're looking at a Sargon video reacting to Lindsay Ellis. So when we talk about social constructs, we're talking about things which, as a society, social society, these are things that we have invented as a society to either deal with a situation or abstract a more complex situation. This is what gender is. Sex is similar. It's how we define the way the physical differences between what we call male and what we call female. I haven't watched the Riley Dennis videos, so I can't speak to exactly what she says. But my understanding of the sex is a social construct is basically that um, beyond, again, the way certain uh, diseases and chemicals interact with male and female physiology, the differences between the sexes are almost entirely social. So, one of the big arguments TERFs make is that men are more violent and prone to rape. That's true in our society. But it wouldn't be difficult to imagine. In fact, it's trivial, at least for me, but I've always had a pretty good imagination, to imagine a world where women were socialized to be more violent and aggressive sexually, and thus they are more prone to violence and rape. And obviously, the goal of most gender abolitionists and people like myself, socialist leftists, is to create a world where no one is socialized to be more violent and uh, sexually aggressive, so that we don't have to deal with that in our day-to-day life. But what TERFs want to do is they want to enshrine our current gender roles, like in Amber, as if they are the quintessential gender roles, and they are natural and completely unchangeable, as if they haven't changed in the last century, let alone over the last millennia. this is where TERFs go crazy.
Position that nobody actually has.
Biological sex has to undergo the same paradigm shift that gender did. We need to start thinking about it as a social construct rather than an inarguable fact. So if you're a trans woman, you're female. If you're a trans man, you're male.
There's a part of me that wonders if Lindsay's aware of this, but what I find really interesting is this bit.
I'm sure she is. She's intelligent enough to have watched the video before recommending it as backing her argument, and it doesn't detract from her argument. No one is erasing the concept of sex. What we're trying to do is erase the idea that sex is somehow immutable, or that someone born of a certain sex is inherently going to behave a certain way regardless of how they are raised, or the situations of their life. Like, just because someone is born with a penis doesn't mean that they're going to be aggressive serial rapists. Like, I keep going back to this argument, but it's the one that TERFs love to go with. It's one of their biggest arguments, that women should be safe in women-only spaces. I agree. Everyone should be safe in all spaces. Although that is a little all lives matter reductionist argument. But the problem is that they assume that there's something inherent to people who are assigned male at birth who will just go into these women's spaces and want to rape and kill. Yes, since Sargon loves to take his time, I'm running it at 1.5 speed. If people have trouble understanding what's being said, I'll be happy to slow it down. But also because it's a 30-minute video and I don't want a 2-hour-long response to it. So, Lindsay Ellis is basically making the argument here that no one is saying that sex doesn't exist. What we're saying is that sex is a social construct, and so what it means is based on our society. And what these TERFs are saying is that sex is an intrinsic characteristic of humanity, and that what it means to be a man or means to be a male is intrinsically linked to your biology when nothing indicates that is the case. And so outspoken lately is because she has to, despite the absence of the UK, the farts are very much losing ground. Farts, I don't remember what that is. Feminist appropriating reactionary TERFs or something like that?
No one is saying chromosomes are not real, Joanne.
As you're going to see, that's only because they can't. They have argued that everything else doesn't exist, but chromosomes are the last piece in the puzzle that they can't make go away. And so Riley Dennis's conclusion is that chromosomes...
No one wants chromosomes to go away. Unless that's what you're trying to say, Riley Dennis, in which case I doubt it. The left, and not to say that everyone who believes in trans rights, everyone who is against JK Rowling is against is on the left. Everyone who is against JK Rowling is on the left. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the left is generally pretty solidly pro-science. Because science is the best way of finding the truth of reality. So when you try to say that sex, that these anti-TERFs, these feminists, whatever, SJWs, whatever term you want to use, Frank, are trying to eliminate chromosomes, you're basically saying, not in so many words, that we're trying to deny science. We don't do that. It's TERFs who are denying science, or at least the social science. Actually, transphobes. Thank you. Yep, that's what I thought.
Don't do anything. Let's take a look at Riley's argument and see how she gets to the conclusion that biological sex is a social construct.
Chromosomes themselves are not social constructs, but deciding to call XX chromosomes female and XY chromosomes male is a social construct. Now, I'm not saying that classifying things is wrong or that we shouldn't try to understand bodies at all, but I do think we could do it better.
So Riley is taking a fundamental contention with the accuracy of the language that we are using for. Now, I think it's important.
Only because she's pointing out that we arbitrarily decided to call XX chromosomes female and associate people who express the typical physiological characteristics of someone with XX characteristics as female and as a woman. This is where the social construct comes in.
Important to note that at this point, the Darwinian position on sex is that procreation is the purpose of courtship. The gender roles of man and woman exist to facilitate this courtship, and this is why they are tied to the reproductive roles of male and female, which has the ultimate.
Darwinian? Okay. Darwin lived 150 fucking years ago. Again, this is a very right-wing thing, assuming that all liberals or people to the left of Ronald Reagan hold Darwin as some immutable god, same as we hold Marx or something like that. In truth, both Marx and Darwin were very intelligent people who were products of their time, who wrote down some very good ideas, published them, and put them out into the world. And if you haven't watched Philosophy Tube's latest video of Marx versus Darwin, it's a really good video. I do recommend watching it after you're done watching me. But the point he makes at the end of it is that both of them have had a great deal of influence and will continue to have a great deal of influence on the world, but that they are not the only ones who have had an influence, and that they are not the final arbiters of how we look at the world. So just because Darwin thought that the purpose of gender roles was procreation doesn't mean that's changed. Doesn't mean that hasn't changed. Gender roles have changed significantly since Darwin wrote his book. So even if that was the case in the late 19th century, that has changed.
Goal of siring children. But Riley's position is actually a lot more direct than that.
What you need for reproduction is one person who can produce functioning sperm and one person who can produce functioning ovum. Our decision to call people who usually can produce sperm male and people who can usually produce ovum female is a system that we invented. And you don't stop being female if you can't produce functioning ovum.
The words themselves are indeed things we created, but the words themselves have been created in order to describe real and objectively measurable phenomena that we have encountered in our daily lives, and our ancient ancestors would have encountered long before we even had speech. This is something animals have biological sexes.
This is something that I think a lot of people misunderstand about social constructs. Just because social constructs are invented to describe things which we observe in societies, to talk about them. So this is something that I've talked about this a little bit before. I first encountered this concept in Mark Rosewater's blog, talking about Magic the Gathering, that if you want to talk about something, you have to have a term to describe it. This is why one of the biggest obstacles to discussing something is finding a term to use to describe it. And why one of the biggest things that a lot of people who disagree with changing something will do is try to discredit the discussion. This is why social justice warrior became such a buzzword and why it was used to describe everything. Why Republicans use socialism to describe anything to the left of hunting poor people for sport. Because by tarnishing that label, by you assigning it to every bad thing, you make it so that it's easy to dismiss anyone who talks about it because they're just talking about the bad thing. So what he doesn't understand, what Sargon is, I'm going to go ahead and charitably give Sargon the benefit of the doubt here and assume that he's not deliberately misunderstanding here. That social constructs exist to give us something to discuss the phenomena we've observed in society. We've noticed that women and men are different, so we talk about those differences, but the differences are socially constructed. If you stick a group of people in the woods with everything they need to survive, but no social or historical baggage, they're not going to develop into the same gender roles that we have today necessarily. Now, it may come that that women tend to be more of the gatherers and men tend to be more of the hunters. This is again due to physiological differences between men and women, male and female. But those changes are not intrinsic to the chromosomes, which is the important thing. We can change them with hormones. We can change them with surgery. We can change these things. So they're not locked in, inherent, intrinsic to the biology. They're just what happens to develop naturally, but we can change that, which is why it's a social construct. I do think there's something called embodiment, whereby the gender you associated is heavily influenced in by the body you were born in. Like most, even those who feel a bit gender fluid, probably influenced a bit by their sex. Sure. And I mean, the fact that, 98% of people in America are cisgendered, yes, absolutely. But the idea is that gender is not a binary, and sex is not a binary either. So, just because you're influenced by it, I mean, I'm not really sure. I agree that yes, people are influenced by the gender they're assigned at birth, by the physiological characteristics of the sex they were born as, but that has as much to do with their social conditioning, their socializing, as it has to do with anything physiological. People born boys are going to be treated differently than people born girls, and that happens, from the moment they're born, if not before. Like, a lot of people seem to think that buying gendered toys for kids doesn't have an effect on them, when it definitely does.
Doing it better, in Riley's view, is the abolition of the categories, our criterion that make male and female, male and female. This has already been done with the gender roles man and woman, and so now this has come to the sort of final stop. It's got to be done with the biological sex, because otherwise there is going to be something that is biologically male, biologically female, and then there will be an other, a label that is either transgender or hermaphrodite, and that is exclusionary by its very nature. Because it is not fitting into these definitions, it is being excluded, and if we don't want to be exclusive, we have to get rid of these definitions. And I'm not exaggerating this. This is how she does it.
It's not like all people with penises fit into one box and all people with vaginas fit into another box. It's like they're all in the same box, but people with penises tend to hang out on one side and people with vaginas tend to hang out on the other.
As you can see, she has taken away the criterion of male and female, the two boxes, and obliterated them. So now there is no male and female, and simply people with penises are on a...
Yes. Because, again, except for some very esoteric physiological differences, there's not really much utility in differentiating between male and female in general. And especially when we're talking about how what we want to change society to observe, this continued perpetuation of gender roles, such that boys like to play with GI Joes and guns, and they wrestle and they fight and they're aggressive, and girls are passive and they like to have tea parties and play with Barbie and dollies, and that this perpetuation is basically what leads to these issues that people mistake for intrinsically in the genders. The idea that men are more violent than women is a result of men being socialized to be more violent and aggressive than women, not because men are, again, intrinsically or inherently more violent.
Just generally on one side of a grand box that encompasses the entire human species, and people without on the other side. It's actually the destruction of the ideas of male and female that is what Riley is driving at.
Female implies woman, woman implies female. Keeping the traditional definition of female means continuing to make trans women an abnormality, something unusual and different and weird.
But the thing is, they are different, aren't they? They're not actually the same as biological women, and we can't, from an evolutionarily
In almost all respects, except for the ability to bear children, as far as I understand it, yes, trans women are women. Their biology is, by and large, female. And part of her point, I assume, I'm not going to say I know exactly what Riley Dennis was thinking, but I'm guessing by her by what she said there, that by continuing to treat trans people as this other, this weird outlier, it also contributes to harm by treating trans people as being this weird other. And that's why one of the biggest steps forward is to not treat trans people like they are weird, like they're uh, uh, some sort of abnormality. They're just people. They may sound a little funny based on what you're used to, but who cares? Everyone sounds funny to other people. I hate the sound of my own voice. Whenever I have to edit one of my videos, I hate listening to my own voice, so I skip through it. I can't imagine what I sound like to other people. I'm glad for everybody who does show up to listen to me every day. But that doesn't mean that I'm wrong or bad, or that trans people are wrong or bad. And ending this stigma of treating them like they're bad or other needs to stop.
Evolutionary perspective pretend that they are. I mean, if our appropriate expectation for finding a partner to settle down with and start a family includes finding a fertile partner of the opposite sex, then yes, being transgender is something unusual that actually stops that process. We have to be able to identify and deal with the...
But you're assuming that everyone wants to find a fertile partner of the opposite sex to settle down with. You're ignoring gay people who may want to, who may be interested in same gender people. You're ignoring bi and pan people who don't care about the gender or other presentation of people they want to settle down with, or people like me who couldn't give two shits about finding a fertile partner. That maybe I don't want kids, so I don't care about the fertility of my partner. In fact, I'd probably prefer if they were infertile. So you're uh, foisting the you're projecting your desire for fertile for reproductive couples onto everyone in reality when that is so not the case. And this is even ignoring ace and aromantic people who ace people don't want to have sex at all. That doesn't mean they can't have a partner, they just don't want to have sex with them. And aromantic people who don't want to be in a romantic partnership but still want sex. Do you think an aromantic person wants kids? I'm sure some do, but I'll bet most don't.
The fact that we can't sire children with someone who is biologically of the same sex as us.
Being trans inclusive means recognizing that we should not be calling trans women male. Calling a trans woman male implies to most people that she's a man, which is inaccurate. Biological sex has to undergo the same paradigm shift that gender did. We need to start thinking about it as a social construct rather than an inarguable fact. I would argue that sex needs to go through the same change that gender has already gone through. It's not a static fact.
This is pure ideology. Searching for terminological accuracy, if you were trying to find a mate, could, by Riley's definitions, end up with you marrying a person who does not produce the opposite gametes to yourself, and therefore will never give you offspring.
If you get to the aisle and you haven't figured out that your partner is an infertile trans person, then someone is fucked up along the way. Probably both of you. Like this is the classic fucking argument, right? Well, if I go out looking for looking to get laid in a bar, and I find a nice, pretty girl, or what I assume is a girl, and I get back and she whips out her dick. Well, that's not right. Well, someone's fucked up somewhere. If you get all the way back to the taking off your pants stage, and she hasn't mentioned that she's pre-op trans, or that she still has a penis if she doesn't intend to get the operation, both of which are valid, of course. So if you're marrying someone and you want to have kids, that's something you should talk about before the wedding. I mean, I've never been married. I've never been affianced or whatever the proper term is there. I've never been engaged to be married. But I'm pretty sure you should talk about those things before you start planning your wedding to make sure you're compatible. Of course, this could just be Sargon's tradcon beliefs that you should find someone to marry and not have sex before marriage, and that the assumption is that a relationship is to be a procreative one. I know plenty of people who have zero interest in procreative relationships, who are otherwise what most people consider normal heterosexual people.
If the ultimate purpose of your dating life is to settle down and have kids, then this definition
True, irate lump. Yeah, he is preoccupied with breeding. That's true.
actually leaves us open to not achieving that. We might pair with someone who does not fit the required criteria, and even us voicing that complaint could be called transphobia.
You may have heard the terms hermaphrodite.
It 100% depends on the context. Now, I've never been in a relationship with a trans person, but I would imagine that somewhere around the second or third date is probably, depending on when the sex question gets broached, is probably when the person's transgender identity should get broached, assuming they are what is colloquially referred to as pre-op. I have seen some persuasive arguments that a trans woman, as an example, who has had bottom surgery, has been on hormones for years and years, and is literally in every way passes for women, like buck naked, they pass for a woman because they are women, that you probably don't need to talk about, they probably don't need to mention that they're trans until the relationship gets more serious. Now, I definitely feel that as a measure of honesty, that people should, if you start to get really serious, like if you're talking about moving in together or building a life, particularly if children come up, that trans people should state, should mention that. And if nothing else, I know there was a big controversy here a month or two ago about a YouTuber who was trans, and basically their like ex-partner, ex-husband or something outed them as trans because they found out, surprisingly. I don't remember all the details. It was a while ago, which both in quarantine and internet years means it was like in the Stone Age. But if a trans person is in a relationship with a cis person, but the trans person is in all ways passing as a trans person, or as a like, if you couldn't tell the difference even when they're buck ass naked between them and a cis person, then again, until like the relationship is actually serious and you're looking to build a life with this person, I don't see why there needs to be this discussion. So it really depends on how the conversation gets brought up. It's like, if you just ask someone out of the blue, "Are you trans?" that could be transphobic. This is the deal. Conservatives don't believe in nuance. Conservatives don't believe that there is a simple and nuanced way of discussing something. So they think that anytime you ask a trans person if they're trans, ask someone if they're trans, you're being transphobic. But there are definitely situations where it could be relevant. And it all depends on how you approach it. Like, really.
hermaphrodite or hermaphrodism used, but these are widely considered to be outdated, inaccurate, and hurtful words. So please don't use them to refer to intersex people.
To protect the feelings of hermaphrodites and anyone else who feels that they fall outside of the male-female binary, Riley has abolished this otherwise useful term that then brings on the further problem of how to legitimize.
Hermaphrodite is a portmanteau of Hermes and Aphrodite, the two Greek deities. The idea was that intersex people were the melding of man and woman, when that's kind of not right. The intersex people can have characteristics of both, or more characteristics of one than the other. But the point is that hermaphrodite is often used as a pejorative. That's why it often hurts people. And I know that Carlgon doesn't care about hurting other people. He doesn't care about insulting or harming other people, but a lot of people do. And so we have to think about how our words affect other people.
Male and female, and to solve this problem, she has abolished those as well. So now there is no male, there is no female, there are just humans with genitals, and they're all in the same category, purely because some people might feel like they're being excluded and that it is hurtful. Because we are dealing with an imperfect...
No, because that's how it is. Like, if you... This is one of the big arguments that a lot of conservatives have railed against is hospitals distributing information about instead of referring to someone as a pregnant woman, refer to them as a pregnant person, or gender neutral language, because more and more, gender is not something that is obvious just looking at someone. And more people are getting more and more comfortable with sort of mixing gender signifiers. Like if Riley Dennis had a beard, as the most obvious and crass example. So when we use these gender neutral language, it helps to solidify in people's minds that a given gender role is not intrinsic to biology. And it also helps to prevent the aforementioned depression, anxiety, suicidality, and other issues that comes with being misgendered or having your identity invalidated. And I know that sounds very wishy-washy and SJW, but it's the truth. Unless you're okay being the reason someone commits suicide, unless you're okay with being the reason someone self-harms or falls into a depressive cycle, just consider the words you're using. I don't understand these people. That's not true. I understand them. I just think they're fucking crazy.
Process that can be modified after the fact through surgery or hormones or whatever. This means to Riley that the imperfections of the system are delegitimizing the entire system. Because if you can't simply categorize hermaphrodites as a third category that are not the same as males and not the same as females, either neither or both, then this is somehow not speaking to a fundamental truth about the human condition. But that's only because you got rid of the category of hermaphrodite because you found it offensive.
Because sex has never been only about chromosomes. It's been about all 5 of these traits. And tell me, what good does dividing people based on their chromosomes do?
Well, the good it does is actually social and emotional. I mean, I can completely see the argument from a mother's point of view that she doesn't want biologically male people in a changing room with, say, herself and her 10-year-old daughter.
Tell me why someone like ContraPoints, Natalie Wynn, should be a threat to a woman in a changing room. Because according to you, she's biologically male. But I defy anyone to point to the biological male part of her, especially in a changing room. Or even in a changing room, I should say. I don't know if she's had bottom surgery. I don't care. But look at her and tell me where the man part of her is, where the male part of her is. Because again, as I've said before, as I'm going to keep hammering this in, the violent and aggressive nature of men is because of how they're socialized, and is not intrinsic to them being men. So while I will totally bite the bullet and say that most violent offenders are men, most rapists are men, most murderers are men, that doesn't mean that all men are violent, all men are aggressive, all men are rapists, all men are murderers. That's not what I'm saying at all. But to assume that all of them are is just as harmful as assuming that all black people are violent or all women are passive people pleasers who just want to everyone to get along and be nice. So you can't assume that just because a trans woman was assigned male at birth that she's going to be as aggressive or violent as the boys you grew up with.
Or something like this. And it means that this sort of sex segregation is generally considered to be positive for women's protection. Again, these are very much contingent, real-world, empirical factors that are being considered here, but that's not the discussion that Riley's having. Riley's having a purely theoretical discussion. And from the position of this theoretical discussion, she is trying to reverse engineer what it is to be either male or female.
Also, these assumptions that only women or only men are aggressive and rapey ignores the very real number of women rapists and women assaulters in the world. It basically assumes that only men are going to do this.
Female, to the point where she can suggest that certain categories actually can be ticked off by use of surgery or hormones or any other physical modifications or lack of ability to perform, and therefore this undermines the very nature of what it is to be male and female.
They would have female hormones, secondary sex characteristics, and genitals. So 3 of their 5 ways of determining sex would be female. They wouldn't have male or female gonads at that point, and let's assume their chromosomes are XY. That means that 3/5 of the sex criteria point to female, and only 1/5 points to male.
Riley can go through this list and knock them all down until she gets to the very bedrock, which is the chromosomes, the immalleable biological part of a person's body that they just don't have the power to change. In all of the things, they may have removed their gonads, they may have removed their genitals, they may have removed their secondary sex characteristics, and they may be pumping themselves full of hormones that create the change within the body that transitions them from male to female, but fundamentally, they will never have the chromosomes of the opposite sex, and it's artificially and externally that these other modifications have been made, because left.
So, do you want to put a very expensive piece of scientific medical equipment at the door of every bathroom to test every person who goes in's chromosomes? Because that's the only way. This is something that they've been trying to do in America is, what are your chromosomes? I don't know what my chromosomes are. I assume they're XY. I'm a dude. I was born a dude. I'm pretty, masculine-ish. But I don't know. And again, I feel like I just keep repeating myself. I guarantee that Carl has never checked his chromosomes to make sure he's really, really male. True. The intrinsic violence of men is not related to chromosomes. Even if it was something inherent in men, even if it was something that was part of our biology, it wouldn't come from our chromosomes. It would come from our hormones or from our some other part of our physiology. Words are hard. It wouldn't necessarily come from our chromosomes, so even then, it wouldn't be intrinsic to maleness. And if it was part of our hormones, that's fucking easy to change. We've had that for decades.
Left to its own devices, the body and the chromosomes in the body would produce gonads, genitals, secondary sex characteristics, and the sex-appropriate hormones for that biological sex. So it's only through great effort and actually acting against the inclination and natural development of one's own body that we can get to a position that we can say, actually, these things don't even exist. It is only by knocking off all of these other external and anterior factors that Riley can drill down to the very heart of the problem. You can pump yourself full of different hormones, you can cut off your secondary sex characteristics, you can cut off your genitals, you can cut off your gonads, but you can't do anything about your chromosomes. You're stuck with these. And so Riley has to essentially demonstrate, using the definition of sex that we have, that in fact, because these things are not permanent, as in they can be physically modified, therefore they are not valid. However, that's not the case. The a priori assumption of what a woman is stems from the kind of chromosomes that they have, that creates the kind of body that they have, which means their secondary sex characteristics, their hormones, their genitals.
All of which can be changed relatively easily. I mean, compared to some other things to change. We can change how someone presents. We can change their secondary sexual characteristics. We don't really have a good method of creating a fake dong that's functional for trans men, but we can make pretty realistic looking fake vaginas on women, and they can even get cervical cancer and diseases like that shouldn't be possible if they weren't if they didn't have those characteristics, those parts. So she's basically, what Riley Dennis is saying was that when we look at all of the things we use to define whether someone is a man or a woman, if you've had surgery, if you're on hormones, if you're dressing differently, all these different characteristics can be changed over to the other gender. And more people are embracing non-binary, where they embrace things that are socially part of one gender, even though they are the other. Not to say, obviously I'm using a lot of language like gender is a binary, but we're talking about man and woman here. I'm talking about men who wear makeup or get their nails painted, or wear more feminine clothing, or I remember when I was a kid, and it's changed significantly since then, but when I was a kid, it was considered gay or feminine for boys to wear to have both ears pierced. In fact, when I went to get my ears pierced when I was a teenager, if you got your right ear pierced but not your left, then that was signifying you were gay. I'm not joking. This was the belief of people my age at the time. I believe that it was left is right and right is wrong, was how it was told to me. So of course, as a good little social acclimatizer, I got my left ear pierced. Now I have both ears pierced. So I don't give a fuck what people think. And there's a lot of clothing that is gendered for no good reason. And there's a lot of styles that are gendered for no good reason, other than because that's how it was done. Consider that 60, 70 years ago, a woman wearing pants was the height of impropriety. You've all seen Grease, right? The movie from the 70s, John Travolta, Olivia Newton-John. There's the scene at the end where Olivia Newton-John comes out in a halter top and leather pants, was scandalous for the 50s. Pretty normal for the 70s. But it would have been absolutely the height of scandal for her to do that in the 50s, because women don't wear pants. Why? Do women not have two legs that junction? Arguably, as a man, pants are probably more comfortable for women because they don't have external sex characteristics that can get bound up in the joint.
The gonads, with the eventual function of producing a fertile woman. It is not wrong that definitionally women have XX chromosomes and produce ovum, whereas men have XY chromosomes and produce sperm, even if
that's only definitional for cis people, and not even all cis people. What about infertile women? What infertile people? Men, as far as I'm aware, Infertile men don't produce sperm, or at least they don't produce live sperm. And I know that infertile women don't produce. Well, no, I take that back. Infertile women may produce eggs, but they're non-viable. But what about postmenopausal women? Do they stop being women? This is, I know that's an old argument. I know that that's a stupid argument. But what is the response to that? If women are definitionally XX chromosomes that produce live ovum, what about infertile women or postmenopausal women? Do they stop being women?
Some women don't produce ovum, and some men don't produce sperm if they're not capable of reproducing. Even if our definition is not infallible, that doesn't mean it's not a good definition, a proper and right definition, and has real-world use.
If a definition has exceptions, then it's not a valid definition. Particularly scientifically speaking. If a scientific definition has exceptions, then it's not a complete definition.
And since we're talking about more than 99% of the population who fall into one of these categories, XX or XY, it appears that we are talking about something.
We don't know that it's 99% of the population. We just know that approximately 0.6% of the population or so expresses characteristics that indicate that they are intersex. They have male genitalia but have ovaries and a uterus. Or they have a vagina but have internal testes or something like that. We don't test people's chromosomes because for decades it hasn't been relevant. So unless I misunderstand the science here, we haven't tested enough people to say that that it's true that 99.2 or 0.4 or whatever percent of the population has either XX or XY chromosomes. We just assume that most people, since they have the expected sexual characteristics, are XX or XY. We haven't tested it because there wasn't a need to. I wouldn't be surprised if more people had XXY or X or were men with XX chromosomes. They exist. But if they express as men, you know, they've got the full complement, they grow facial hair and whatever, why would you test that?
Something real that is merely an imperfect.
Hey, Just Liberty, how's it going?
Perfect biological process. The question really is, what do we want the strength of our justification to be? Whenever we adopt a belief, we always have some kind of justification for it. And the strength of that justification is how convincing and committed to that belief that we are. There are two schools of thought, one called fallibilism and one called infallibilism on this, and it is pretty much how it sounds. The fallibilist school of thought is into which most of our beliefs fall. Most of our beliefs and knowledge are fallibly justified. We believe something could be true, but we can't rule out the possibility of it not being true. And that really does apply for almost everything. I mean, for example, we can't prove that we are not brains in jars that have been hooked up by some mad scientist and are giving us false information and created a simulated world around us. We don't know that that's not the case. I mean, if all information we have comes through our senses, how could we prove it otherwise? But we don't really have any compelling evidence to suggest that we are brains in jars, and so it becomes the reasonable position to assume that we are in fact not brains in jars, we are looking at the real world. However, epistemologically, Riley and Lindsay have approached this from the infallibilist position. They are looking to be able to rule out the possibility of error. Now, with such demonstrably flawed and imperfect beings that are life forms, that's
science. The whole scientific method is to create experiments which remove errors of human errors or scope errors or errors of the experiment, whatever errors there might be. That's the scientific method. That's the point of the scientific method. And if you create as an experiment that has some aspect of it which is non-falsifiable, then it's a bad experiment. And Riley and Lindsay's whole point is that just because this is how we view things, we view reality, or we view sex and gender this way, that doesn't necessarily mean that's how it is, and especially that's not how scientists view it, how sociologists view it. The layman's view of science is often very different from the scientist's view of science. And so her whole point is that we need to bring the popular notions up to date with the scientific and sociological positions.
Not going to happen. You are always going to have many, many flaws, and you're going to have to be able to account for what will effectively be category errors because of an error in the process to create whatever it is you're trying to categorize. This is just an aspect of life. And the thing is, what would be the problem with that? If someone didn't fit neatly into these categories, then surely I could just come out and ask them about it, couldn't I? Well, apparently I couldn't.
Calling a trans woman male implies to most people that she is a man, which is inaccurate. Plus, asking if someone is male or female in this context is really just asking them what their genitals are, which seems like a question that's a little too invasive to ask people most of the time. Like, if you manage to convince everyone that sex and gender are different, asking a trans woman her sex is basically just asking her what's between her legs. It's a polite way of getting private information about someone.
Well, yes, of course it is, but that's what the terms man and woman and male and female also do. They also reveal private information about people, and for good reason. There are significant...
So, if a trans woman has had bottom surgery, and so they no longer have a penis between their legs, you ask them, are you male or female? And they say female. But weren't you born a man? Well, yeah. So don't you have a penis? Well, no. Do you see why these terms are inaccurate and less useful, particularly as society and science marches on?
Morphological differences between men and women, which gives them different and competing desires and interests, which primarily revolve around sex and reproduction. When someone presents themselves...
Because of how they're socialized. Oh my fuck. Men and women have different and competing desires primarily because of how they're socialized. If they weren't socialized the way they were, they might have different desires. And we're seeing this as more and more women come into previously men-only spaces, competing with them as they're no longer socialized to not go into those spaces, to not compete with men in those places. And vice versa, as more men move into women's spaces and compete with them for those spaces, like teaching or secretary work or what have you, or nursing. The fact that we call someone a male nurse because they're a man and a nurse, but when you say nurse, you assume it's a woman. Like, that is what we're talking about changing these gender roles. And none of this is intrinsically linked to their chromosomes. Chromosomes determine a few things about your development, and that's it. Everything they determine about your development, we can change. With the sole exception at this time, at this moment in time, of giving trans men a functional penis. We aren't really there yet. There's a couple of experiments, there's a couple of ways of doing it that work kind of okay as I understand it, but we're not there yet. But we will get there one day. We'll figure it out.
As female, they're trying to tell other people that they're in fact in possession of a vagina and a womb, and once someone presents as male, they're actually trying to tell people that they're in possession of a penis and testicles. This is actually something other people need to know. Society is built around the interactions between men and women, and so it's not surprising that they would have quite a formalized and baked-in set of rules.
If a woman has her ovaries removed due to cancer, is she no longer female? If a man has his testes removed due to cancer, is he no longer male? I don't think so, and I don't think you can say that gonads define a person's sex without believing that.
I find it interesting how everything is a spectrum until it comes to either male or female, and then, no, that's either 100% or 0%. You're either male or you are not male. There's no spectrum at all there. I think that this does exist on...
What? Wait, did I misunderstand what Riley said there?
That they would have quite a formalized and baked-in set of rules.
If a woman has her ovaries removed due to cancer, is she no longer female? If a man has his testes removed due to cancer, is he no longer male? I don't think so, and I don't think you can say that gonads define a person's sex without believing that.
I find it interesting how everything is a spectrum until it comes to either male or female.
Her whole point was that what defines male or female is more than just their gonads or sexual characteristics. That sex is a spectrum of definitions, of characteristics, only one part of which is their gonads or sexual characteristics. So, why do you think she's saying it's not? Fucking lying again, Carl. Slippery little liar. Weasley little liar, dude. Still lying.
And then, no, that's either 100% or 0%. You're either male or you are not male. There's no spectrum at all there. I think that this does exist on a spectrum, and I think losing your fertility.
She was pointing out how people try to say that if you still have a penis, then you're a male. When, what about every other part of the person that indicates they're not a man? You know, the tits and the no facial hair. And I don't like using long hair as an example of a female characteristic, even though it kind of is. Mostly because I've had long hair most of my adult life. But that's another instance. If you wear a dress, if you get your fingernails painted, if you wear makeup, all of these are social signifiers of woman. So if you have someone who has their hair done up all fancy, if they've got, makeup on tastefully done, they've got prepped fingernails that are painted all nice, they're wearing a dress, but they have a penis that undoes everything else, that's where your argument doesn't make sense, Carl. Hey, next, how's it going? Yeah, he'll literally turn on a dime if it's convenient.
Does give you a hit to your maleness or your femaleness. And I think that's just a fact of life. It's not a very pleasant one, but it's just something that I think is true. And I think that people feel that. When women go through the menopause, I think they feel like less of a woman. When a man can't get an erection, I think he feels...
That's because they have been socially programmed to view their ability to bear children as part of their identity as a woman. When a man loses his balls for whatever reason, he feels like less of a man because he's been socialized as his virility, his ability to bear children, or to father children. His potency is stored in the balls. The potency is stored in the balls. So when those get removed through an accident or what have you, then they identify as less of a man. But I know plenty of people, plenty of men, who are very masculine, very proud of their masculinity, very comfortable and certain in their masculinity, who've gotten fixed, who've gotten what the fuck is the term for getting your nuts cut? The official term doesn't fucking matter. I know plenty of people who have done that and still are very masculine. My uncle, who is ex-special forces, very much the quintessential conservative man, had his nuts cut years ago. He never went through a crisis of masculinity. But you're trying to say that some women go through menopause and have a crisis of femininity shows that the ability to bear children is intrinsically linked to femininity, to womanhood, to being a woman? No. It's because of how they're socialized. It's because of how they're taught, how they're brought up, how the people around them treat them. It's not intrinsically linked to their biology or physiology.
It's like less of a man. Because fundamentally, I do think these things are tied in essence.
Vasectomy. Thank you, Next SVK. Yes, that's the word I was looking for.
To the reproductive ability of the biological organism that is the human being. But anyway, we finally come to Riley's conclusion.
If chromosomes don't determine your hormones, secondary sex characteristics, genitals, or gonads, what purpose do they serve in differentiating people? The answer is they serve no purpose. There's no reason to divide XX people and XY people. That is an arbitrary distinction that has no effect on how the person looks or behaves or navigates the world. Sex is not a biological fact because it is determined by things that are largely changeable, and the only part of it that is unchangeable doesn't have any real world effect. So it is just as much a social construct as gender is. So if you're a trans woman, you're female. If you're a trans man, you're male.
So I just want
Based. She laid the case out there perfectly. Chromosomes affect certain aspects of your development, which we can then subsequently change. So treating someone differently based on their chromosomes is essentially treating them differently based on... it'd be like treating someone who was born at night differently than someone who was born during the day. Whatever effect it had can be changed relatively easily, and it doesn't actually affect the things you think it does.
to make it perfectly clear. Chromosomes define your hormones, your secondary sex characteristics, your genitals, and your gonads. Our ability to modify these after the fact is not evidence that chromosomes have no real-world function. The distinction between men and women is not arbitrary, and it is informed by the biological difference.
It is, though. Particularly man and woman, which are gender terms. They're arbitrary. We've arbitrarily decided that the ability to produce milk and bear children is a woman's role, and assigned a whole host of things to that role. And we've well, let me rephrase that, because we didn't arbitrarily decide the ability to bear children was a women's role, but we've assigned a whole host of things to the portion of the species which can bear children and produce milk. We've assigned a whole host of things to that role. And same, the people who father the children, who provide the semen, the sperm for the children, are we've assigned a whole host of roles to them, which have nothing to do with their biology.
Differences between the imperfect categories of male and female. Riley has talked herself around to the exact opposite of reality.
Exactly, irate lump. Yeah. What is an XSVK?
For the purpose of erasing gender and sex, because these categories exclude hermaphrodites and trans people from within their definitions, and that can be exclusionary. And to be clear, I consider Riley's, and by extension Lindsay's, view on sex, gender, and epistemology to be the flat earth theory of gender theories. This is obvious nonsense, and purely because Riley is demanding perfection.
Only because you don't have the technical background to understand it, apparently. I'm a college dropout, and when I was in college, I definitely wasn't taking science classes, but I understood what Riley was talking about. I understood what she was talking about. I can grasp these arguments. Why do you have trouble, Carl?
From a system that is definitionally not perfect, to be done purely for ideological reasons, that are assumed to protect the feelings of trans and...
Right now it is, yes. The arbitrary concepts are things like women are more passive, and they're mediators. They want to find balance and whatever, and men are more aggressive and want to fight and dominate, and women are submissive. Those are the arbitrary distinctions, and that women are better at raising children and being mothers, and men are at best okay at raising children, but they're never going to be as good as a woman. That's what I mean. And the ability to produce milk and bear children is exclusive to females, yes, currently. But these are things that we could definitely change in the future. No, but most people look at a submissive male as less of a man. This is what I'm talking about gender roles. So, while I agree, they're no less of a man. They're still male in every respect. They're still viewed as less of a man if they're submissive. And that's part of gender roles. That's why men are socialized to be more dominant, because if you're not dominant, you're a sissy. You're not many people will say you're not a man if you are submissive or passive or what have you. I've been dealing with that all my life. I was a very passive, shy kid growing up.
And hermaphrodite people. After that long and what I think is a very extreme detour into a realm of pseudoscience at best, Lindsay then returns to talk about JK Rowling.
Just because you don't understand the science doesn't mean it's pseudoscience, Frank.
And the concept of the death of the author.
We're talking about death of the author. I personally believe that you can't really practice death of the author in its purest pure form.
Once again, asserting the infallibilist position on the subject at hand. Why would we need to do anything in its purest pure form? What kind of standard is that? Like, what has Lindsay Ellis ever done in her entire life that was of the purest pure?
I've watched Lindsay Ellis's video, and if I remember correctly, she explained that, especially in academia, which is where death of the author originates, it's difficult, if not impossible, to separate the author from the work in an academic sense.
Form. The answer is nothing. And so should she abandon doing anything? Because it's not going to be the purest pure form? Of course not. Because life is not a pure game. It's not abstraction. Life is real. It is.
It's also worth pointing out that she went on to point out that You can practice death of the author from a consumer point of view by not purchasing things which benefit the author. Don't buy new books. Don't go to the new movies. Don't buy officially branded merchandise. That is how you can practice death of the author. But when we're talking about, critical analysis, it's difficult to separate the art and the author, if I remember her argument correctly. Hey, Wizard's Bread Book, how's it going, man? Oh, my divorced friends tell me to man up and boss my wife around, right?
It's empirical. It is contingent. It's in your face. You've got to deal with it. It's not going to be exactly as it should be conceptually, but you just have to deal with that. Again, there is no point looking for perfection in a definitionally imperfect world. You are not going to find it. It's unreasonable to set your bar for success so high.
If for no other reason than if you are in any kind of discourse setting, be it academic or Twitter, other people aren't going to really allow it. They will bring the author into it, and that is going to introduce subconscious biases, which is of course going to affect your reading of the text.
Yes, we will not be perfectly unbiased, but we could try to be as unbiased as possible, and at least trying and failing but getting 2/3 of the way is surely.
But her point is that you can make an analysis based on death of the author, ignoring the author's point. But particularly on Twitter, people are going to bring other arguments up, so you have to be able to you have to consider those to make a valid argument.
Better than not
True,
trying at all
Wizard's
and not
Bread
getting
Book.
anywhere.
No matter how hard you try to be unbiased or whatever. So you can try to practice death of the author, but as long as you're engaged in a community, other people are probably going to bring the author in whether you want them to or not.
But what this all comes down to is really a calculation in power politics. It's incredibly Machiavellian. Lindsay Ellis wouldn't care unless JK Rowling was powerful. It's literally how she describes it.
JK Rowling is not only alive, she's also relatively young and has tremendous power and influence and a lot of followers and a lot of money and a lot of control of her intellectual property. And I've seen a lot of takes, and I don't really want to address them all, but basically you can try to be rational about the whole thing and be like, don't support her financially, but the reality is it's a lot more complicated than that. How do I reconcile the fact that the author of the series is using her power to do such incredible harm, all while genuinely believing that she is doing the right thing, with the fact that the series was so formative for so many people? How do you reconcile this? The answer to that is, I don't know.
Riley really has got Lindsay to think herself into knots over this subject, hasn't she? Lindsay's argument is purely that she thinks that JK Rowling is doing harm using her Twitter account.
There is a difference between a...
She is? Because the only reason why JK Rowling has the following she has, what does she have, 4 million fucking subscribers? Or followers. Let's see. 14 million followers. Holy shit. Yeah. 14 million followers because she wrote a supremely popular and influential book series. Like, as I said at the beginning, I'm a huge fan of Harry Potter. I have been for 15 years. I'm not going to sit here, almost 20 years, like I said, about the time the 4th book came out. I'm not going to sit here and say that Harry Potter is some trash literature. I think there's some good points to it. I think it's mostly neoliberal utopian literature. I mean, one of the, just go on a brief tangent here on a video that's already way too fucking long. The positive example of a wizarding family, the Weasleys, are incredibly shitty and dismissive of Muggles. Arthur Weasley, the father, the patriarch of the family, who works in works in a department which ostensibly should give him a great deal of experience with wizarding, with Muggle customs and Muggle material and devices and whatnot, has no idea how Muggles work. He collects plugs because he thinks that they do something. And I've seen multiple discussions about how Ron Weasley, the best friend of the protagonist Harry Potter, is in many ways as bigoted against Muggles as his own as any pureblood supremacist. So while I don't think that Harry Potter is some great literature, it's a good, fun story, has some good points, and its popularity and influence has meant that JK Rowling has a great deal of influence. So when she starts saying things like trans women are men, that creates the issue where that's what Lindsay is referring to. That is the power she has because her words go out to 14 million followers and all of their followers. JK Rowling really getting canceled now? She used to be a very pro-liberalism. She's been getting canceled for a while, next SVK. Pro-liberalism is a very bad term. Nothing better. Yeah, she's been a pretty just remember retconning many things. Yeah, like Dumbledore, and yeah, she's had some pretty shit takes about the world since the story's concluded. Favor gay lesbian rights though. Yeah, I mean she explicitly made Dumbledore gay after the story concluded instead of putting it into the story. Carvo 2, I don't believe there should be a communist vanguard party. What? I'm an anarchist. They aren't next SVK. They aren't male. Let's not even get into the Goblin Bank and Harry Potter, which is some very unfortunate. True, irate lump. Yeah, yeah. The goblins were from a certain reading pretty Semitic, definitely. But I think Lord of the Rings is an okay story that's overrated because it was one of the first popular fantasy stories. Um, I don't know. I think there's again some good stuff in Lord of the Rings, but it's still very much a well. It puts a lot of emphasis on how the right of kings and that kind of thing. Why do so many fascists like Lord of the Rings? Because it promotes a somewhat well, it's a very monarchist book. It promotes the right of kings and that there is a superior, not necessarily race, but a superior group of people inherently and intrinsically. No, next SVK is pretty good. I'm not going to ban him, even though this is some of the worst takes he's come through with, because they generally trans people don't have male hormones, and we've only arbitrarily decided that penises are men genitalia. Yeah, I think maybe we need to time you out, Carvo, too, if you're going to be disingenuous like that. I mean, I'm not saying that. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Lost American Show. I apologize. I don't have a reason to say you're being disingenuous. Although your initial question of whether I want to be a leader of the Vanguard Party was a little questionable. Like I said, I'm an anarchist. I have no interest in being the leader of the Vanguard Party or there being a Vanguard Party.
dead author that maybe has a checkered past and a living one who is using their not inconsiderable wealth and power to advocate against marginalized groups. And this is one of the most insidious aspects of JK Rowling doing what she's doing. She knows that because of her wealth and influence, she's going to be believed more than, the lived experience of trans people and decades of medical research.
Ironically, it's actually Riley and Lindsay who are advocating against discriminated minority groups, marginalized groups, by exterminating the very notion of the category that makes them a group. What Lindsay and Riley are proposing is fundamentally anti-diversity. If you don't...
What? What? Their argument is that our general understanding of gender and sex, as most people understand it, is incorrect according to science and sociology. And that people like JK Rowling are using that incorrect understanding to further an agenda which marginalizes and excludes people. It excludes trans women from women's spaces because allegedly they aren't women, even though they share 3 to 4/5 of the characteristics of women with cis women.
Don't have any categories, then you don't have any marginalized minorities in order to campaign for. If these things are not intrinsic, and if they are not justly defined by the words that we're using, then they don't exist.
This is for the people who are trying to figure out how to reconcile having...
That's true, Carvo, too, yeah. You can't tolerate the intolerant. But I would be a poor leader of communists looking for a vanguard party.
Harry Potter in their past and in their lives with the way she is wielding her power.
This video had nearly 1 million views when I made this response to it, and it seems that a lot of people are very interested in reconciling JK Rowling's power with the fact that she believes that chromosomes have function.
You cannot control the way an author uses their money and influence. Even case in point, right now, I am using my relative extreme micro-influence to advocate against what JK Rowling is advocating for. And if you disagree with me, bye, Felicia.
And there we go. We have nothing to discuss. The differences are irreconcilable. If you believe that chromosomes create biological sex, we cannot have a conversation according to Lindsay Ellis. This is quite an extreme position, isn't it?
And she's going to get love bombed by...
Her point is that if you disagree with her, then you're going to disagree with her and stop listening to her. Unless you're one of the handful of people in the world who are willing to listen to people who disagree with them to maybe listen to their argument. Or someone who listens to an argument in order to come up with a better counter-argument, which is the proper way to do it. I don't know how much longer we're going to go on with this, because he just seems to be reiterating the same points, that chromosomes determine your sex, and that's how it is. You can't change that, even though we can change almost everything that chromosomes determine.
Not only people who agree with her, but people who probably have much more far-right beliefs about trans people than even Rowling does. For instance,
True,
let's say
Wizard's
George Lucas
Book
goes off the deep end and chains himself to a Confederate statue that is slated for removal.
Right, so believing chromosomes determine sex is like supporting people who are fighting to own slaves. Okay. Very moderate.
She's kind of decided that this is the hill she's going to die on. She has a lot of power and influence, especially in the UK, where shameless turfery is a lot more normalized than it is here in the US.
Well, that's kind of to be expected, isn't it? The British are
There's a reason why we call it Turf Island.
empiricists, and Lindsay and Riley are arguing in the abstract about definitions. British culture is very focused around believing the evidence of one's own eyes, painting things warts and all. Perfection isn't even a consideration.
The number of consumers who are going to change their habits because of this thing is vanishingly small.
And thus Lindsay admits that this is an almost purely theoretical exercise for both Lindsay and Riley. As she observes, this...
But J.K. Rowling's influence is going to have an impact on some number of people. This is the law of large numbers. I saw a very good meme, basically, about this in regards to coronavirus. But when you're talking about someone influencing 14 million people, even if only 1% of her followers are influenced to follow her beliefs, that's still 140,000 people. That's not an insignificant number.
is going to have very little effect in the real world.
And honestly, what she is doing does scare me. Such to the point that I would, make a YouTube video in my pajamas reacting to the discussion of death of the author as it pertains to JK Rowling. I think we're at an important crossroads where trans visibility is concerned, and we could either go forward or we could see the loss of what gains we have made. And I don't want to think about what going backward might look like.
This is the final boss of the transgender movement. Every other obstacle has been overcome.
Next SVK, I agree, but I've actually read years ago an interesting discussion on why that is, and it's because basically humans evolved to look at people as the people that they see every day as important people to influence them. And as society has grown larger and particularly more atomized, celebrities are people we see and identify with every day. So they are going to have an outsized influence based on how much we interact with them on our everyday life. So it's partially just, society getting so large, but also the atomization of society largely due to capitalism.
Now the goal is to establish in the public consciousness that biological sex isn't real. Then there will be no excluding trans people from anything, by definition. And if this doesn't happen, then it seems that Lindsay thinks that JK Rowling is going to be responsible for some kind of trans holocaust.
And I don't think I can overstate the amount of harm she is doing right now by tweeting this dangerous crap to her 14 million followers.
Entirely theoretical, abstract harm via the use of definitions delivered on Twitter. Not physical harm, in which a
speech is harm. And if she convinces, again, even 1%, that's 140,000 people, to adopt her turf rhetoric, then that is 140,000 people who are going to go around invalidating people, denigrating people, insulting people, which has additional harm. It ripples out. This is what we talk about being responsible with your platform, because the words you say have an exponential effect the larger your platform is. If you have 14 million followers, then that means your 14 million followers can potentially see that, retweet it, so all of their potentially thousands or hundreds or tens of thousands of followers see that, and it ripples out, and it ripples out, and it ripples out, and it ripples out. That's the harm we're talking about. As you have these positions, and they cause demonstrable harm to people, again, through the aforementioned depression, anxiety, suicidality, whatever, that is the harm we're talking about.
a person is actually physically hurt, JK Rowling is damaging their definitions, and Lindsay...
It doesn't stir up followers to direct physical violence, probably not, no. But it does stir up their followers to verbal violence by, as I've said multiple times now, verbal, denigrating people, denying their identity, invalidating them, which causes issues for those people because of all the other issues they have to deal with in society.
would like you to cancel her for it.
So I know that this kind of comes off like I'm saying boycott Harry Potter because the author has some bad Twitter opinions. But I think that if this is an issue that you really care about, you kind of have to.
At least Lindsay can admit that her desire to cancel JK Rowling is entirely theoretical and based on a kind of interpretational schism, you know, like a religion.
She is normalizing misinformation and making it genuinely dangerous for trans people to exist.
No, it's making it theoretically dangerous because we have otherwise yet to provide any evidence that JK Rowling is actually physically getting...
No one is saying that she's going to cause physical violence. But we have ample evidence that rhetoric like hers causes mental and emotional violence against trans people.
Trans people hurt because of her belief that biological sex exists. This entire thing is an exercise in hypotheticals, which is why Lindsay sounds so disingenuous when she concludes that she must be angry about it.
And that makes me mad. I don't like it.
Lindsay is forced to say,
never did Rowling say that people should go to trans people and directly tell them they're a different gender. No, but by saying that trans women are men, you are directly invalidating many trans people's identity and causing her followers to get the impression that invalidating someone's identity is bad. It doesn't have to be a direct call to action, particularly when you have 14 million followers, to create stochastic bullying. If you're unfamiliar with the idea of stochastic terrorism, then go watch. There's a couple of really good videos. I think PhilosophyTube did a really good video on it, and it's this idea that, and Sargon is responsible for a good portion of this, and Ben Shapiro, where you don't directly call for action, but you dehumanize and denigrate a certain class of people, which leads your followers to act on that belief. Stochastic. Stocastic.
Say that she doesn't like it, but this isn't actually connected to any real-world events that would.
And to be clear, I'm not accusing Rowling of stochastic terrorism, but stochastic is the term for when you make a statement that is not a call to action, but it ripples out and calls people to take certain actions.
Genuinely rouse the passions in a circumstance like this. She can't point to any of JK Rowling's victims without pointing to every single trans person that exists. And what kind of person is going to be seriously persuaded that all trans people are the victims of JK Rowling, the children's author?
And what she's doing.
Okay, we're done here. No one is saying that all trans people are victims of JK Rowling's followers. What we're saying is that JK Rowling will increase the number of people who denigrate and invalidate trans people, which causes harm. If you've made it this far in the video, I appreciate you sticking with me. This was quite the slog, but I felt that Sargon going after Lindsay Ellis on such a contentious issue would be a good one to go after. So, yeah. Once again, Sargon completely abandoning nuance and assuming that the only kind of violence is when you punch someone in the face and that words can't cause violence. Business as usual for Frank. Hey, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the show. Remember to like, share, and leave a comment because it helps me. Subscribe and ring that bell to help you. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.